You go ahead and close the door. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of Fred Kemp, our president, and Barry Pavel, head of the Scowcroft Center on International Security, who really is responsible for today's event, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion, Stronger Defense in a More Dangerous World. Thank you all for joining us here today. Before I begin, I will note that this session is on the record and is being live streamed online. You can follow along on social media using the hashtag #ACDefense. Part of our core mission here at the Atlantic Council is to provide a prominent platform for transatlantic leaders to provide insights on how they are navigating the dramatic changes in today's world. And we are especially pleased to hear from our closest allies in NATO on this set of crucial issues. Analyzing and providing a way forward on key NATO issues and convening NATO leaders is in the Atlantic Council's DNA. And we are truly stepping up our efforts in programming, events, and publications in the run-up to NATO's seminal 2016 summit in Warsaw. Now, today's an extraordinary honor to host the United Kingdom's Secretary of State for Defense, the Right Honorable Michael Fallon, today at the Atlantic Council. Now, given the events of recent weeks, from the Paris attacks that shocked the world to the UK's new air campaign in Syria, today's discussion could not be timelier. In just a minute, Secretary Fallon will discuss the UK's defense strategy for the next 5 years in the midst of the most challenging security landscape the transatlantic community has faced since the end of the Cold War. The vision outlined in this defense strategy, the Strategic Defense and Security Review, is bold, sending a clear message that Britain is revitalizing its defense posture, fulfilling its NATO commitments, and solidifying its global role at a time when it is most needed. As Secretary Fallon said when he was last in the United States in March, the UK has no intention of lowering its guard to protect the international rules-based order on which our security depends. This ambitious thinking underscores the enduring importance of the U.S.-UK special bilateral relationship, which remains a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy and engagement in the world today. Now, none are more qualified to shepherd this special relationship in the realm of defense and execute the ambitious defense strategy than Secretary Fallon. I would be up here all day if I were to list all of Secretary Fallon's accomplishments throughout his career in government, from his distinguished tenure as Minister for Business and Enterprise and Minister of State for Energy. He has led UK's Defence Ministry for over a year with strategic vision and keen political acumen, and I sincerely look forward to his remarks today. After Secretary Fallon's keynote address, we'll have a rich discussion with the Secretary, moderated by the esteemed Karen DeYoung, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and senior national security correspondent for The Washington Post. Once again, I'd like to thank all of you for being with us here today, making it a very extra special event. I know it will be a captivating conversation. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the stage Secretary Fallon.
Thank you, and good morning. And I am delighted to be back in the United States, a place where I always feel at home and that I have visited many times since my first visit over 30 years ago as a young legislator as a guest of your government. That was in 1984, at the midpoint of the Reagan presidency. And that allows me to remind you of something President Reagan once said. Great Britain and the United States are kindred nations of like-minded people and must face their tests together. We are bound, he said, by common language and linked in history. We share laws and literature, blood and moral fiber. The responsibility for freedom is ours to share. Our freedom was threatened by Nazi evil, and our two nations united to defeat it 70 years ago. Today, we are threatened by a new evil, Islamist fascism. This year, We've seen its followers slaying innocent Americans in a San Bernardino daycare center. We've seen them slaughter young French people socializing in Paris. We've seen them murder 30 of our own British tourists on a beach in Tunisia. To defeat this evil, we require a unity of purpose and a total cross-government response. That doesn't just mean shutting down ISIS's online presence, stopping its financial support, preventing fighters from crossing borders, and building up the capacity of fragile states. It means also calling out the extremist narrative. Those susceptible to radicalization must understand that the way of ISIS-Daesh is a metaphorical and literal dead end. The only item on their agenda is the destruction of our nations and the establishment and enlargement of their own barbaric realm. No one becomes a terrorist from a standing start. There is a process of radicalization involved. So we need to expose that Islamist ideology for the perversion that it is. Nor can we say, sadly, that this process has nothing to do with Islam. All of these extremists are self-identifying as Muslims. As your president said in his Oval Office address, this is a real problem that Muslims must confront without excuse. But nor must we hand a propaganda coup to them. The mouthpieces and apologists for ISIS-Daesh paint their war as some kind of clash between Islam and the West in order to sow division. But the facts are different. ISIS-Daesh kills more Muslims than any other group. Our anti-ISIS-Daesh coalition is made up of many Muslim countries who recognize that what's at stake here is a conflict between those who love life and those who love death and chaos. So our challenge is to support the reforming voices within the Muslim community, preventing the fusion of religion and politics and stopping the slide into extremism. At the same time, taking pride in what our two nations offer all our people, whatever their color, whatever their class, whatever their creed, not discrimination or sectarianism, but freedom of religion, freedom of tolerance and opportunity for all. Again, to quote President Reagan, speaking here at the Atlantic Council, our consensus is built not only on what we're against, but on what we're for. We're against totalitarianism, we're for freedom and democracy, for them without hesitation or apology. And if we are not true to those values, we will not in the end discredit this poisonous ideology. Now, part of the cross-government response that I referred to has to involve the use of force. There can be no compromise, no deal with Islamo-fascists. Those who murder innocents at a Christmas party, who behead aid workers, who throw gay people off buildings, have to be stopped. That was the message from the United Nations Security Resolution 2249, calling on all member states to take, and I quote, all necessary measures to expunge the extremists. The United States and the United Kingdom have always stood side by side against terror, against Hitler, against Al-Qaeda, and now as part of the anti-ISIS-Daesh coalition. From the very start, the United Kingdom has been flying missions in Iraq, has been providing some 60% of that coalition's tactical reconnaissance. And last month, our Parliament voted decisively to answer the call of our allies and to lift the shadow of the 2013 Syria vote. So let me assure you today that in Britain, we are stepping up alongside our American, French and coalition allies, bringing the full force of the Royal Air Force to bear, helping to destroy ISIS-Daesh infrastructure, cut off its oil supplies, and locking on to its leadership. Our recent national security strategy makes clear, however, that ISIS is not the only danger that we face. We are threatened now by multiple concurrent risks: a resurgence of state-based threats, an expansionist Russia, and a growing threat from cyber. Collectively, these threats challenge the rules-based international order on which our joint security and prosperity depend. We are, in Britain, a powerful partner today with capabilities and reach that few, if any, of your allies can provide. But I want to tell you now that we're going to be an even more powerful partner in future. First, we're investing in stronger defence in a more dangerous world. We were elected as a government earlier this year to deliver national as well as economic security. So we're increasing defence spending. We're in fact the only major country choosing to spend 2% of our GDP on defence and meeting the OECD's goal of spending at least 0.7% on development, helping us to play our part in stabilising and supporting broken and fragile states and preventing crises turning into chaos. Over the next decade, thanks to that extra investment, we plan to spend more than $265 billion on new equipment. That money will underpin the centrepiece of our Strategic Defence and Security Review, our Joint Force 2025. To respond to increasing demands in future, we will have a potent expeditionary force of up to 50,000 personnel, made up of an army division, a maritime task group, and an expeditionary air wing as well. Earlier this year, some retired generals, no names, no pack drill, were concerned about the size of the British Army. Let me reassure them and you, Britain will remain one of the few countries in the world able to deploy such a highly capable division in the field. And now we'll be able to deploy 2 self-sustaining strike brigades alongside it. At sea, we'll have a maritime task force of new frigates and destroyers alongside, in the 2020s, the world's second most capable carrier force. In the air, we will have more F-35s online more quickly, delivering our carrier strike capability, and we will have 9 new maritime patrol aircraft to help protect the nuclear deterrent that we are renewing. All this, and we are also enhancing our global strike capability with more investment into our special forces. Our new joint force will let us do more independently, but also more in tandem with you. And that's why we've made a point in this review and our new equipment plan of investing in shared platforms like the P-8, like Rivet Joint, like Reaper. And with the United States choosing to locate its European F-35 base in the UK, I look forward not just to welcoming some of you on board our 2 new carriers, as I was welcomed on the USS Theodore Roosevelt earlier this year, but seeing our F-35s flying from your decks and your F-35s flying from ours. So we have and will have the will and the means to respond. And as we become a stronger partner of yours, I want to see that relationship become more of a two-way street. We're investing more in you, and we're going to expect more from you as well. I want to see more contracts in the supply chain flowing from the majors on these programs through to British companies. We already have areas of shared interest, such as our nuclear enterprise. We're going to be spending some $47 billion on renewing those 4 new nuclear successor submarines, at the same time as you are looking to replace the Ohio that uses exactly the same common missile compartment. We're building 15% of each F-35 that's produced, from tail parts to wingtips. We have unique dual-mode Brimstone missiles, bringing a high-precision capability to the fight against ISIL-Daesh that the United States does not yet have. Many of these companies that we use have footprints here as well as in the United Kingdom, illustrating a level of industrial integration that is unique, and it surely makes more sense now for us both to benefit from that expertise that exists in both our countries. So more investment in more defence. Second, we're going to do more to project our influence around the world and strengthen the international rules-based order. Today, UK forces are involved in more than 20 operations around the globe. We're one of your few global partners. In Europe, we're your closest ally. And we've been urging our European colleagues to up their game. The threats that Europe faces on its eastern and its southern flanks illustrates the value of a joined-up response, using our membership of NATO, the United Nations, and the European Union to protect our security. We have pressed the European Union to play its role as part of a comprehensive approach, mobilizing its economic might to enforce sanctions on Russia and to cooperate more on security across the European continent in the wake of the slaughter in Paris. None of that means giving up on British sovereignty. What it does mean is that we can enjoy the best of both worlds, free to act on our own accord with the swiftness and strength that comes from being an independent nation, but working also with a bloc of 27 other countries to advance our shared interests. But NATO, of course, will always remain the cornerstone of our defence. In Wales last year, your President and our Prime Minister urged NATO members to do more. Since then, 7 countries have followed our lead in pledging to increase their defence spending. And we are, too, stepping up our leadership role, leading the High Readiness Spearhead Force in 2017, bringing 6 northern European nations together as a new expeditionary force, and maintaining a persistent presence in the Baltic states and Poland. We're also looking beyond Europe's borders, doubling our peacekeeping efforts in Africa and strengthening our hand in the Asia-Pacific. We're elevating our defence relationship with India, with more joint military exercises and deeper cooperation on technology and manufacturing. We're enhancing our relationship with Japan. In January, we held the first combined foreign and defence ministers meeting in London, and next month we hold the second in Tokyo. And when it comes to China, we are very clear. We want to work more closely with China, help bind China in to that rules-based international order. But provocative behaviour in the South China Sea only destabilizes the region and increases the risk of miscalculation. We want to see maritime and other disputes there settled peacefully in accordance with international law. Third and finally, innovation. We will have stronger defense, we conclude, through the investment that we're making in more innovation. Your own third offset strategy addresses the erosion of the West's technological edge. Our strategic review also recognizes the need to keep ahead of our adversaries in cyber, in robotics, in autonomous systems, in space. We're putting $1.5 billion into an innovation fund to help secure operational advantage in future. You've set up the Defense Innovation Unit experimental to access innovation in the Silicon Valley. We will be launching our emerging technology and innovation analysis cell to help identify game-changing technologies. We're setting up a new center to pool the intelligence of the best brains in British business, academia, and the public sector. Next year, we'll introduce a Defense Innovation Initiative, adopting a different approach to risk and doing more to test new ideas. But we know that when our two countries work together, we're more than the sum of our parts. It was exactly 75 years ago that British scientist Henry Tizard, at the height of the Blitz, set off for the United States on orders from Winston Churchill, armed only with a briefcase full of top secrets. That precious cargo, containing blueprints for radar, for the jet engine, and for nuclear fission, helped in the end to win the war. We need to build on those firm foundations. Today we're collaborating on everything from F-35 to insect-like Black Hornet UAVs and quantum clocks. As Defense Secretary Carter and I announced after our October talks, we're now going to tighten up those links, working together on emerging technology demonstrators, making better use of joint wargaming to test out new ideas, and adapting new operating concepts for a new environment. The opportunity that comes from innovation has wider applications. Defense technologies are often spun off afterwards in the commercial sector. Together, we've given the world GPS, the World Wide Web, splash-proof technology. Recently, British company Reaction Engines and BAE Systems signed a deal to develop the Sabre synergetic air-breathing rocket engine, an aircraft that will operate at over 5 times the speed of sound, that can transition to a rocket mode, allowing spaceflight at speeds up to orbital velocity. Once that was the stuff of science fiction. Today, our scientists in our two countries are making these things science fact. And we need to do more together to take advantage of these dual-use technologies. So let me finally say, in conclusion, at a time of growing threats, nuclear, conventional, state-based, or terrorists, the United Kingdom is stepping up with bigger and stronger defense. We are increasing our defense budget. We are increasing the size and power of our armed forces so that we can do more to protect our security. And in so doing, we aim to become an even stronger partner of our most steadfast ally, the United States. Open societies, successful countries like Britain and the United States attract enemies as well as envy. The more open we are, the harder we must work to ensure that all our people enjoy the security that comes with greater freedoms. As I look ahead to these threats, I recall the words of Karl Popper, who said, "We must plan for freedom and not only for security, if for no other reason that only freedom can make security secure. So rather than falling back on the politics of fear or on any counsel of despair, we need together to plan together for our security, for freedom, and for prosperity. And if we do that, together we can overcome this evil that we face. We can preserve our cherished values. We can open up more opportunities for our people to make their mark. And together, in a darker, more dangerous world, we can continue, the two of us, to be a light amongst nations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And thank you all for being here. I'd sort of like to start at the general and then get into the specific. I think it's clear that over the past 5 years, Britain has increasingly been seen as a power in retreat and not pulling its weight. And that seems to be something that you own, your government owns. I think that you've spoken about it, the Prime Minister spoke about it as he introduced the security review, and that now it's been reversed. Do you think that's because the world has changed, or is it because Britain has changed?
Well, first of all, we had to take some painful decisions when we first came into office back in 2010 to restore our public finances and to rebuild our economic security, because you can't have national security without economic security, without being able to afford the defense spending that you want to commit to. So we have done that now, and it's been a painful process during which we did not, I think, retreat from the world, but during which obviously we've had to rebuild the strength of our armed forces. But we're through that now, and as I've set out, we aim now to expand our armed forces, to add more manpower, more equipment, a new offer for our personnel. But you're right, it is also clearly in response to the growing threat to our security that has fairly definitively increased since the previous review to this one back in 2010. We've seen these threats multiply, we've seen them increase in complexity, we've seen them increase in concurrency, and we need to be ready to respond to that.
You spoke, in addition to terrorism, you spoke about state-based threats, and that's, in fact, a big part of the security review. Is that directed primarily at Russia, or are there other state-based threats?
Well, we've seen a resurgence of Russian aggression that we did not see back in 2010. That's something new. We'd all hoped that Russia would become more of a partner, more of a country that we could trade with and deal with in international fora. But this attempt in the Crimea and Ukraine to change international borders by force, the constant pressure on the Baltic states, the increase in long-range aviation, the increase in submarine activity means we have to regard now, sadly, Russia as more of a competitor and a threat that we have to take measures against, not least because of the increase in their own defense spending, both on nuclear and conventional forces. So yes, Russian aggression is something we have to counter, and the Russian threat is something we cannot ignore.
But I wonder if you see that as the same kind of threat that was posed during the Cold War, a nuclear standoff. I wonder, for example, why Britain feels a large part of this additional expenditure is the increased cost of the nuclear deterrent, Britain's nuclear deterrent. Is that something that you feel is still necessary vis-a-vis Russia? Is it something that's a wise use of Britain's resources at a time when the most immediate threats seem to be coming from a somewhat different direction?
But the whole point of a strategic review is not simply, if I may say so, to focus on the very immediate threats, but to try and think ahead to those threats that there are over the horizon. And we look at the nuclear world and we see some 17,000 nuclear weapons out there at the moment. We see expenditure by Russia on its nuclear program, but also the testing by North Korea of nuclear weapons and so on. And put it very simply, if we were sure that there would be no nuclear threat emerging against our country throughout the 2030s, the 2040s, and the 2050s, right up to 2060, if we could be sure of that, then of course we would have a fresh look at our nuclear deterrent. But we can't be sure of that, given the 17,000 nuclear weapons that are out there, given the instability that we see at the moment, and the possibility of those weapons proliferating into evil hands. And that is why we have taken the decision, and it was in our manifesto, and we were elected on this basis, to renew the deterrent that has served us well and has served both our countries well.
One of the things in the security review, as you talk about a realignment of spending priorities, is something that I think would be very difficult to do here, which is a decrease of 30% in the number of civilians that work on I don't know if it's in the ministry or on defense issues in general. And this comes on top of earlier cuts in civilian. How can you, having cut the military, now building it up again, continuing to cut the civilians, it seems to me that it's hard to find a balance in terms of who is going to do all of the work beyond actual warfighting and operating machinery. How can you get away with that?
Well, as you know, we still have a deficit in our public finances, and we have to deal with that deficit by, in overall terms, reducing the size of the public sector and helping to grow the private sector of the economy. And it isn't possible to insulate defence entirely from that. We took a very conscious decision as a government to reduce the amount of spending we spend on our welfare system and to increase the amount of spending overall that we're spending on defence. But in terms of the administration that lies behind it, we have sought greater efficiencies. Now, the actual reduction in the civilian workforce will only total 30% when it includes some of the programs that are currently underway, are included in that. Reductions that have been planned since 2010 and reductions that are that are planned to start in the next couple of years. So the actual percentage reduction that is additional is, I think, just under 10%. And we have the next 4 or 5 years to adjust to that. So it is not as severe as reported.
Are there similar cuts in other parts of the public sector?
Yes, there are worse cuts in other departments. So it was not possible to entirely insulate defence from that overall reduction in the administration of central government.
Just to move to ISIS, you said, I was struck by something you said in a session just before you left Britain, which was that Britain needed to act when your friends call for help. And I wonder if you could talk about that call for help. Obviously, the United States has been involved in Syria for a long time. Most of the people who started out, the Gulf states, certainly Jordan, who started out in the air campaign, they're with them, are not there anymore, or are there only in a very small way. Should we interpret this as something that just follows the Paris attacks? Was it something that predated that? And what form did it take? I mean, does the president call up the prime minister and say, you know, this is not going well, or it's getting worse, or we really need you to participate?
Well, first of all, we've been involved right from the start in the coalition, in the campaign in Iraq. We were one of the founder members of that campaign. Right. Of the 60 countries part of the coalition, there are some 20 involved in military action. We've been there from the start. It is our aircraft that have been flying day and night, 6 days a week, ever since then, when, as you say, some of the smaller air forces have had to reduce or regenerate. We have been part of that, sustained part of that campaign, providing strike in Iraq, flying surveillance and reconnaissance over both Iraq and Syria, and being part of the training effort to sustain the Iraqi and the Kurdish forces. So we have been there from the beginning, but we have been very conscious since last summer that the license that Parliament gave us to operate in Iraq was always somewhat artificial, that this was a line in the sand between Iraq and Syria that ISIS itself does not respect, and that it was somewhat illogical to require our own aircraft to turn back at the border and not pursue across it. We gave Parliament a very good illustration of something that happened early in November, where some democratic Syrian forces were under extreme pressure from ISIL, and the nearest plane was an RAF jet some 7 minutes away, but couldn't come and help because it meant crossing that artificial line in the sand. And it took some 50 further minutes for a coalition aircraft to get there. So we've always been conscious that this has been an artificial decision, but we've had hanging over us the vote against action in Syria that was taken in 2013. Now, of course, it's true that the terrorist attacks we've seen around the world, in Ankara, in Beirut, and in Paris, and you've had it more recently than that, of course, have increased the call from our allies to come and help. France is our nearest neighbour. We were bound to ask ourselves what would happen if we needed urgent assistance, and the French National Assembly had simply said, you may be our nearest neighbour, but we're not going to do so. Or how our reputation would have stood if the United Nations had passed a resolution calling on all member states to bring their particular capacities to bear to eradicate ISIS, and we as a founder member of the United Nations had not responded to that. Or indeed the call from the United States for us to bring the precision strike capability that you use as part of the effort in Iraq to bring it to bear in Syria. So all these things, I think, came together and enabled us to put this vote back to Parliament and to win it with such a convincing majority.
But the 2013 vote was about bombing Assad.
It was a very different vote. It was a vote to stop Assad using chemical weapons against his own people. And it was, of course, a vote in the previous Parliament. The composition of our Parliament has changed since then, and the dynamic has changed. We have now a majority Conservative government. So now is the right time to revisit that and to put it straight.
The President, I think, talked in September about going to the allies and asking for more. Do you think that would have been possible without the attacks in Paris? Was that the galvanizing situation that really left people, certainly in Britain, as well as in other places, saying, whoa, this does affect us, we need to?
Well, it brought this terrorism to within 2 hours of London. So clearly it has a galvanizing effect. But it's also true, the coalition has been urging us for some time to recognize the illogicality of not being able to strike across this completely artificial line in the sand. So as I say, I think all these pressures came together, and in the end we got the right result.
There's a lot of criticism in this country, I'm sure you've heard it, certainly from Republicans, but also from Democrats, that really the administration doesn't have a strategy, that its strategy of precision bombing is not going to do the trick, that if you look at the number of airstrikes over the past year, almost year and a half, it's actually very small compared to other similar campaigns in Afghanistan previously. How would you answer people here, as you're here speaking to the American people who have been very critical, and the public too, according to polls, saying, we don't understand that this is a strategy. We don't understand how it's supposed to work. You say you're going to decimate the Islamic State, and yet according to our own military people, they're not contained.
Well, I'll be reviewing the strategy with Secretary Carter this afternoon, but let me just say one thing. The United States has been at the front of this battle since the rapid advance of ISIL last summer. It is the United States that led the international coalition and still leads the international coalition and is providing the huge bulk of the air effort in Iraq and also in Syria. Now, some of there are limits to the strike capability and the precision strike that the coalition has at its disposal, which is why they particularly wanted our Tornadoes, our Brimstone missiles, our Raptor pods to join in the effort. And some of the strike effort in Syria has necessarily had to focus first on close air support of the Kurdish forces in the northeast of Syria. I hope now we're going to see a new focus on more deliberate targeting of the infrastructure that supports ISIS, the oil, the supply routes, the ammunition depots, the logistics, the command and control centers that will enable us to degrade ISIL, stop it resupplying its fighters in Iraq, and slowly tighten the noose around Raqqa, where all this stuff is organized and directed and inspired.
Are you concerned about, as you narrow the area where they're operating, again, particularly in Syria, about civilian casualties? Is that something in Raqqa? We've heard about human shields, certainly in Ramadi, also in Iraq. Is that something that is a big issue in Britain?
Yes, it is. It's an issue, I think, for all members of the coalition. We all have rigorous rules of engagement, slightly different from each country depending on the legal position, but fairly rigorous rules of engagement that minimize any risk of collateral damage or civilian casualties. And we've been at pains with the strikes that I've authorized over the last year and a bit in Iraq to make sure that that we absolutely minimize the risk of civilian casualties. And it's also true that in the advance to liberate Ramadi, obviously the Iraqi forces too and the Kurdish forces are going to do their best to try and limit civilian casualties. They're being held up by IED at the moment, but nobody wants to see any unnecessary civilian casualties as a result. But one answer to that is to use precision airstrike to slowly choke off Raqqa and to ensure that the grip that ISIL has can't be reinforced. We're seeing fighters, I think, leaving Ramadi now as the Iraqi forces encircle it, and we need the same to happen in Mosul and in Raqqa over in Syria.
Are there any limits on British strikes in Syria? You've started, obviously, as part of this broader campaign to go, as you described, to the oil fields to stop the supply lines, to stop the shipment of oil as a revenue stream. Does Britain have any limits on where it feels comfortable striking in Syria? In other words, if the campaign moves farther to the west and certainly up into the northwest, is that something that you assume Britain would also participate in?
Yes, where there are clearly identifiable ISIL targets. It's not simply the area around Raqqa. ISIL, as you know, is contesting areas over in the west and indeed down in the south and around Palmyra too, right over on the eastern side. Wherever ISIL is, we're ready to strike. As part of the coalition effort.
Maybe if you could just explain a little bit about how that works, how the targeting works. Who decides who hits what target in what time frame?
Well, these targets are selected by the operational commanders of the coalition, and through the Air Force component, they're then allocated to the different air forces that are ready to make their strike aircraft available on any particular day or night. So we are part of that process. But when it comes to the individual target, then that has to be compliant. If it's being attacked by British aircraft, it has to be compliant with the rules of engagement that I've set. And if it is a deliberate target, then it has to be authorized by myself or one of my deputies.
I'm sorry, I don't understand that. What's the difference between
Well, there are what we call
target?
dynamic targets, where we have close air support above ground forces that are engaged in combat with the enemy, where they can be called in to help deal with particular positions. But there are also deliberate targets like oil wellheads, depots, particular buildings and so on, where these can be planned in advance, where there is a process whereby they are cleared with if they're British aircraft are involved, they're cleared with me back in London.
It's become a truism here that, and I'm sure in your government, that there will be no victory without adequate ground forces, both in Syria and in Iraq. We talked about how even as the U.S. and the U.K. have been upping, along with France and some others, their participation, certainly the Arab Gulf states have decreased their participation. There's been some talk about having an Arab ground force. Some of the states, the Emiratis, have said they would participate in that. There doesn't seem to be any interest on the part of the Saudis. How important do you think that is, and how much of a problem is it that the regional governments, certainly in the Gulf, I'm not talking about Turkey, but even Jordan, have actually decreased their participation in this campaign? How important is it for them to be major visible players, and what would change if they were willing to put in a ground force? Would that be a good thing?
Well, in the end, there have to be ground forces there. There have to be ground forces to be able to offer security, particularly to the Sunni areas, as ISIS is thrown out of the towns and cities and villages that it occupies. There have to be ground forces that can offer that security, just as there will be. That security will be provided by the Iraqi forces and the National Guard when it's fully established, as ISIS is pushed west along the Euphrates over on the Iraqi side. There are moderate opposition forces there who've been fighting Assad for the last 4 years, and they will need to be deployed against ISIL. What is clear is that those forces can't be Western forces. Prime Minister Abadi put this very forcibly to me in the summer when I was last in Baghdad. He does not want British troops, or with great respect, American troops on the ground fighting his battle for him. He knows that in the end, the security in these areas can only be underpinned by local forces, homegrown forces that are locally supported and can win the confidence of the Sunni areas. So this will have to be done by homegrown forces, perhaps with the support, as you say, of other regional players as well.
Do you think that that's very likely to get a Sunni Arab regional force to go in?
Well, what's encouraging now about the political track that's now underway is that all the countries involved, all the neighbours, are part of this process and realise that this civil war has to be brought to an end, and I hope will be part of leading Syria to a new future, helping in the reconstruction, and yes, becoming part of the process of helping to train and equip and sustain some Syrian security force that can be developed that will enable us on the ground to finally get rid of ISIS in its heartland.
Are you disappointed with what they've put into this effort so far?
Well, each of the countries in the coalition, they're all helping in their own way. Some have been helping militarily, some have been helping financially, some have been helping with logistics. Increasingly, they're all part of the strategic communications effort now to tackle the ideology, and more of them, as you will hear, are part of the network that is firming up to deny the access of ISIS to the international financial system. So they're all helping in their own particular way, so I'm not going to single any of them out for criticism, not least because it is only now that Britain is joining in the campaign in Syria.
What, do you hear anything about the political meeting in Riyadh and what the outcome of that is?
Well, I've seen a readout of the talks that went on yesterday. That was, if I can put it like this, that was, day one of a political process that has to now unfold. Is clearly going to take weeks and months to get agreement on some kind of transitional settlement that will eventually lead to a new government in Syria, and how the various groups that are committed to a more plural Syria will shape up and be part of that. The most encouraging thing over the last couple of months is the support for that now from Saudi Arabia, from Iran, from Russia, from most of the players involved who've been fighting Assad. That process is underway, and we need to encourage it.
I apologize because I didn't know we were going to have audience Q&A, but we are now, so we don't have a whole lot of time left. So just to get in as many questions as we can, if you please be as brief as you can. Sir, back there. Had his hand up first.
Thank you, Rahim Rashidi with Kurdistan TV. Please, what is your opinion of Kurdish forces Peshmerga role in fight against ISIS? And after Paris attacks, how important is it to arm the Kurdish Peshmerga directly by UK and allies? Thank you.
Well, thank you. I saw for myself on my recent visit to Erbil the Peshmerga in training, and I have nothing but admiration for the fight that Peshmerga have got involved in against ISIS. They are truly the bravest of the brave in the way they've taken the fight to ISIS. We have supplied a large amount of equipment to them, and we're continuing to train, continuing to provide the training that they're going to need, not least in dealing with the improvised explosive devices that they're encountering. But the answer is nothing but admiration.
Yes, sir.
Good morning, Secretary. My question is really...
Could you identify yourself?
Sure.
Sorry.
I'm Patrick Wilson with SH Global Strategy. Good to see you again. My question is actually some advice for the American people. The recent attacks in Southern California signal a change in America's posture about the possibility of domestic terrorism. I know that you, having grown up in the UK, you experienced 2 decades of persistent threat of domestic terrorism, and I wonder if now, sitting in your perch, if you have some advice for the American people about countering such a threat.
Well, it's not really for me to advise America on these issues. We have lived with terrorism, Republican terrorism from Northern Ireland, for many years. And we've all now seen these attacks. We've seen attacks in Ankara, in Beirut, in Paris, in Denmark, and elsewhere. And we've had them too on the streets of London. So we're all naturally looking to our own homeland security, doing more to share intelligence, radicalization, but above all, to focus on where all this is coming from. And in the end, that takes you to northeast Syria. It is from there these attacks are being directed, organized, inspired, financed, and that in the end is where we need to step up. And I'm delighted that Britain is now fully stepping up.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Yasmin Tajday with National Defense Magazine. I wanted to ask about that innovation unit you mentioned earlier. So you kind of compared it to DIUX that we have over here. Does the UK have its own kind of Silicon Valley that you can tap into? Do you plan to do work with our DIUX? How's that going to work?
Well, as I said, we want to learn from you and to collaborate more with you. I've been impressed by the way in which you've been able to tap into some of the fizz, if I can call it that, of these smaller high-tech companies, and bring their applications to bear on defense solutions. So we're setting up a defense solutions center, and traditionally we've put tenders out there. We've said we want a frigate or we want a plane, who wants to build it for us? What we've not said to our high-tech center is, you come and tell us what solutions you've got to some of the challenges, some of the technologies that our adversaries are employing. So we are setting up a defense solution center, inviting the smaller companies to come to us and put solutions on the table. We're putting some challenge funding there, so we'll run competitions. We're setting a new target for the proportion of our defense spend that will go to small companies, small and medium-sized enterprises. We're going to up that to 25% of our total spend to try and attract more of this brain power into defense.
Yes, sir. Let's try to do a few in a row. We'll probably try to do 3 questions and then go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, sir. Aaron Mehta with Defense News. The P-8s aren't going to be online until 2020, I believe, is the year they're going to come on. So are there discussions with the U.S. about some sort of stopgap capability given the apparent threat from Russian submarines that have been appearing in the last year?
Okay.
And there, why don't you just hand it right there, and we'll do those 2 there.
David Smith of The Guardian. CNN is running a story at the moment saying that you've been talking about much closer coordination with Russia within Syria, that the UK and Russia are actually going to collaborate much more closely. I just wonder if you could elaborate on that.
Right, and the third one was where?
Go ahead.
Hi. Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. Speaking of Russia, we've obviously spoken a lot about Syria, but you mentioned that there are nation-state threats. Given limited resources, how do you develop a military that can deal with both the ISIL kind of threat and the very different requirements of a nation-state threat?
Right. Well, on the first one, are there going to be discussions about accelerating the arrival of the P-8? I think it was the gist of your question. And the stopgap capability. Yes, there will be discussions, and I hope they will be this afternoon. Because we need the increase in Russian submarine activity and the development of Successor. We need to enhance that capability as quickly as we can. On the second question about collaboration with Russia, no, there's not collaboration. There have been discussions with Russia about setting up some means of avoiding any miscalculation with its long-range aviation. We've seen a number of incursions into the British flight information region over recent months, and we've been pressing for ways of avoiding any miscalculation or accident, because these aircraft have not been responding to communications from air traffic control, or indeed from signals from the planes that we send up to intercept them. And there was discussion of that, I think, yesterday at a meeting over in Moscow. We will, of course, through our action in Syria, come under the Memorandum of Understanding there has already been. If you're referring to the Middle East theater, there is already a Memorandum of Understanding between the United States and Russia to ensure that air safety is not compromised in the operations that are going on. So far as the balance between state threats and non-state threats, yes, I mean that's what this review was all about, and we have concluded that we have to deal with both, and we need forces that are agile enough and flexible enough to be able to cope with both types of threat, which is why we are reconfiguring our army into the strike brigades that I described, and why we are giving our special forces more strike capability to be able to move at greater distance and in greater mass, to be able to deploy in larger packets of personnel.
Thank you all so much, and thank you, Mr. Secretary.